I'm going to talk about war and technology. I doubt this is your core sport. Most of you in this room have led comfortable, prosperous, presumably quite blameless lives so far. You may even have declared yourself as post-conflict, a tempting thing to do since the end of the Cold War. The wars that you have witnessed or that have been done in your name, if you're a British or European citizen, have been wars of a particular kind. They've been conducted abroad, largely by small professional militaries, which meant that there was no requirement for social mobilization. And at no point in the conduct of these wars was our homeland at risk. In other words, life went on pretty much as it always does. You just picked up the bill. And many of those wars, you'll judge, were protracted, not conclusively successful, and you really don't have an appetite to do any more of that. But the fact is, there's no written guarantee that I've ever seen that says in your lifetime, war is not going to touch you and your family. And indeed, much of the work that many people in this room conduct is changing the way war is fought, and in ways that make it more likely, not less likely, that war will touch your lives. So I'm going to start with three basic observations. The first one is, despite your personal experience perhaps, there's plenty of war thriving in our world today. It's a rather crude metric, but today there are about 4 conflicts underway that kill around 10,000 people a year. There are another 11 that kill more than 1,000 people a year, but less than 10,000. And another 15 that kill up to 1,000. And some of these conflicts have been underway for 40 years or more. So the direct lived experience for many, many people is of war touching their lives fundamentally. The second observation is war really sucks. There's something about the nature of war which is essential for every citizen to understand, which is, in its nature, it's feral, irrational, destructive, brutal, unstoppable, and in my experience, part of the human condition. And many philosophers will argue that that is necessarily the case, but the human capacity for irrational violence, when the red mist descends, and it all comes down to the death and destruction of your opponent, particularly an opponent that you have somehow managed to dehumanize, is just part of our way of life and touches many people in our world today. And that nature never changes. So when we talk about the influence of technology and war, you have to ground that discussion in that fundamental feral nature of war. And the third observation is, of course, how war is conducted, it changes all the time. It changes with thinking, and it changes with technology. And my guess is, for some people in this room, you didn't intend it to be so, but your work has directly affected how war is conducted. And maybe that wouldn't matter to you if you were sure that the relatively peaceful life that you've led so far in your adult lives was guaranteed to continue into the future. But as I'm sure you're all well versed, if you look at how our world is turning out, then some of the things that have been very familiar, some of the institutions and laws that have promoted our security and our prosperity are eroding. We find that the rules-based international order that we have prospered by is being challenged by other approaches in our world. We are going in our lifetimes to find increasingly that our planet is running out of the capacity to service all our demands and expectations, whether that's water or climate change or resources. And in there are the profound seeds of conflict. So when we talk about war and technology, we are talking about a time that's unfolding where the discretionary wars of the last generation, the Afghanistans and the Iraqs, will be blown away by the prospect in our time, in our world, of wars of necessity where people fight again for existential reasons. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how, in some cases in this room, your work has affected how confrontation and conflict works in our world today. If you do social media or cyber, you have enabled hybrid confrontation. The way that every day states bump into each other and non-state actors bump into states by influencing what goes on social media and cyberspace and paid media and a whole range of activities. It is a way of destabilizing an opponent without resorting to conventional force. And as many of you know, it is a daily feature of lives now. So let's not talk about peace and war. Let's talk about a spectrum of competition, confrontation, and conflict. And then there's the business of hard power. If you do data, if you do precision, if you do stealth, if you do chemistry, then you have helped to evolve the art of hard power. And here, I really don't mean the sorts of wars that have been conducted in Afghanistan and Iraq, difficult and brutal on occasion though they were. Here, I'm looking at the experience of Aleppo and Raqqa and Mosul, where you are seeing the destruction, the deliberate destruction of habitat and mankind, man, woman, and children, through the application of technology in an unbridled and unconstrained way. And even in the military space, and again, this is a very crude metric for which I apologize, in the 13 years or so of the UK combat intervention in Afghanistan, we didn't bring back 454 of my colleagues. In Ukraine, in the current unpleasantness, in the space of between 3 and 15 minutes, a combination of unmanned aerial vehicles and long-range rockets destroyed 2 battalions. That's probably about 900 people in 15 minutes. So that's what technology can do. And there are a couple of implications of if I'm going to may use this, your work so far. First of all, that you have put the homeland here at risk again in the way we have enabled cyber technology at the strategic level to unravel, potentially, our daily life. And we now live again in the era of long-range precision fires, ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. And to put that in perspective, a cruise missile from Russia, with or without love to the UK, takes 90 minutes. A ballistic missile across the world in about 20 minutes. And cyber you conduct at click speed. So if you have in your head a sense of war and technology that requires lengthy mobilization using railway timetables, that's all gone. So the homeland is at risk, and war can be inflicted on you at speed which has never been a feature of the conduct of war in the past. But this story so far is a pale reflection of what you're now going to do for the business of warfare. So many of you in this room, in a thoughtful, intelligent, and world-leading way, aim to transform how we live, work, and play. It's a noble aspiration and one that is taking us to untold benefits. But what you do will transform how nations confront each other and fight. Now, some of this is just about money. So the world spends, say, roughly $1.6 trillion a year on R&D. Alphabet, maybe $14 billion a year. The main US Defense and Research Agency spends $3 billion a year, and it's produced great things, GPS, the original Windows, that kind of thing. But the military transformation in our time will be about the military following the civil sector, partly because of the amount of money that is spent on R&D, and partly because of the potential that you create to fight wars in different and, from a professional perspective, more effective ways. So take data, open source big data, transforming many, many enterprises. Well, of course, it's going to transform how military intelligence is done. There'll still be spies. There'll still be people having secret conversations and listening to conversations and taking photographs of aircraft in space. But most military intelligence will come from what you deliver in the fusion, analysis, and visualization of many buckets of open source big data. Those of you that transform organizations through artificial intelligence in law and accountancy and in engineering, you will fuel a fundamental transformation of how military command and control is done, as how hierarchical, rather rigid military organizations that have existed in pretty much the same model for more than 100 years are torn apart and replaced by a combination of people and machine learning. And the fact is, there are no military people who know how to do that, and they will be coming to you for that expertise. What Amazon does in logistics will transform military logistics, and we'll come back to the subject of robotics. Of course it will. And the progress that you make in the exploitation commercially of space will mean, why would you spend $1.5 billion on a massive military geostationary satellite if you can get pretty much the same picture from a low Earth orbit satellite producing imagery on the internet at $1 a square kilometer? Fantastic. But this really isn't the bigger bet. We talked a bit about this yesterday, but what you can do with AI, data, and robotics will transform how war is fought on land, sea, air, and in space. You are going to drive the advent of a manned and unmanned mix, and that will bring with it this conversation we started yesterday about autonomy. Because, of course, if you can build a machine that kills on the basis of its algorithm, someone will build it. And unless it's carefully bounded, as we discussed yesterday, some abhorrent things will happen, as well as there being some potential benefits. And so we're going to need a debate. I am calling for a debate that is between civil society, government, armed forces, academia, and lawyers, and tech, about how we manage this transformation of defense capability on the back of disruptive technology that is led by people like you. And we need some rules. First of all, this will be led by civil technology. Secondly, this is a competition, the most feral competition in our world. It must be about transformation, not evolution. You cannot win this competition if you just digitize the analog a bit. And most militaries will always be inclined to do that. It'll be about effects before platforms. Militaries love tanks, ships, and aircraft, but they are simply a means to an end. They are a way of delivering a result. So let's talk about the results we want to achieve, and that means we're going to break apart cherished military organizations that have existed in pretty much the same way for 100 years or so. This is a process that will span your entire adult lives and beyond. It's not an event. It will never end. It will mean that military commanders will worry first about dominating the electromagnetic spectrum and then worry about dominating land, sea, and air. Not many of them are thinking in those terms yet. It will mean that cyber protection becomes common not just to military equipment, but to many civil equipment, that if it's fundamental to our daily national life. And the era of synthetically produced electromagnetic pulse, for example, should be something that many of you are considering in the way that you build things that drive our society. And then we've got to have this conversation about autonomy. Let's approach it as an opportunity, but for goodness sake, recognize the demon that underlines it. And Greg, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.